The day began like any other for Cheryl and Paul Chapman until the silence of a peaceful Sunday morning was shattered with a phone call. Cheryl's sister Nancy had not shown up for work, and several attempts to reach her by phone were unsuccessful. The Chapmans, sensing something must be wrong,
Nancy?
rushed to her apartment.
Some killers are stealthy, killing with an almost clinical precision. Others act on a violent impulse, saturating the crime scene with their rage. How a murderer behaves tells much about who he is. In 1987, the brutality of a triple homicide in Anchorage tested the mettle of even the most seasoned investigators. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When Nancy Newman and her two young daughters were found slain in their apartment, local law enforcement needed help. They called the FBI. At the crime scene, clues were everywhere, but seemed to lead nowhere. Agents knew that to crack this case, they need to somehow get inside the killer's mind.
Alaska sits on the edge of the wilderness, seemingly isolated from the rest of the world and its troubles. Its inhabitants are united by the beauty of the landscape and a mutual respect for the self-reliant nature of the community.
On the rocky coast of northern France, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes ashore, the villagers of Karnak wake up each day to a little.
It was shortly before 8 a.m. on a Sunday, March 15th, 1987. Cheryl and Paul Chapman were awakened by a phone call. Cheryl's sister, Nancy Newman, was hours late for the breakfast shift at the restaurant where she worked. Nancy's shift manager told Cheryl that Nancy's car was in the restaurant parking lot, but Nancy was nowhere in sight. Maybe the Chapmans should check on her. From the moment Paul and Cheryl arrived at Nancy's apartment, they sensed something was wrong. There was no sign of Nancy. Her two daughters, 8-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Angie, were nowhere in sight. Coffee mugs from Cheryl's Friday night visit with her sister were still in the sink. The remains of breakfast had been left on the table. The tin where Nancy kept her tip money sat empty. And a brown cigarette butt, not a brand Nancy smoked, was in the ashtray.
Nancy? Nancy?
In Nancy's bedroom, Paul made a gruesome discovery. He found Nancy lying beaten and lifeless on her bed. Paul rushed to the other bedrooms to find Nancy's two girls. To his horror, he found Melissa and Angie brutally murdered.
Emergency?
Yes, rescue the police, please.
What's the problem there?
It's been a homicide.
We've been a homicide?
Our sister-in-law didn't show up from work. They called us at our house when Milford seen her. We came over to find her.
Where at?
4310.
43.
That is terrible.
Just send somebody as soon as you can.
We've got some on hold right now.
Contact 2 at your miss.
Within minutes, the first Anchorage police officers arrived at the Newman's apartment. Not wanting to disturb the crime scene, the officers secured the area and tried to calm the distraught family until the crime scene processing unit arrived. What police found was horrific. Nancy and Melissa Newman appeared to have been beaten and strangled. Little Angie Newman's throat was cut so deeply she was almost decapitated.
Nice. Rigger? Not yet. Is it sick?
Anchorage police officer Bill Gifford was at the scene.
Well, the impact of a case like this is quite often it's hard to capture in words. We're pretty used to working homicide cases and serious assault cases, and overall I think a community becomes, if not callous, somewhat accustomed to these kind of things happening, just a typical murder. Something of this magnitude, however, people are never prepared for.
The murders were so gruesome that even experienced police officers were shaken.
It is shocking for the public, and it takes a toll on the investigators and the officers working the case as well, because you're just not used to seeing, as I mentioned, things of this magnitude.
Nancy Newman's body was lying on her bed, her nightgown hiked up around her chest. There were abrasions on her nose, chin, and forehead, and a knee seemed to be injured. Bloodstains were at the foot of the bed. A pair of olive green gloves were on top of the dresser.
Good idea, would probably. Yeah, do a scrape, see if they can get some. Maybe found something in the bedroom over there.
Down the hall, Melissa Newman was found on her back in the middle of her room. A bloody, twisted pillowcase under her neck. Another pillowcase had been used to tie her arms. Three-year-old Angie Newman lay on her bedroom floor in a pool of blood, surrounded by her favorite books.
A couple shots of the face. There's the bed where all the blood is. Everybody's ready? Here it is.
Bloodstain pattern analysis often yields clues. The positions of the victims and killer, the movements of the victims, and the number of blows struck can be reconstructed by an experienced examiner.
In this particular case, it assisted us in establishing a sequence of events.
Stains found on Nancy Newman's bed suggested that she and Melissa had been forced down the hall to her mother's room, where they were assaulted. And stains on the hallway carpeting indicated that Melissa was then returned to her room and killed there. Officers treated each area as a completely separate crime scene. First, they determined the type of physical evidence that was likely to be found, and then the order it should be processed.
How are we doing?
Given the horrific nature of this crime and the lack of an obvious suspect, investigators knew that every possible piece of physical evidence was potentially invaluable.
Here on these plates, anything else was covered all yet? Super. Great.
Detective Sergeant Michael Grimes was in charge of the Anchorage Police Department's Homicide, Assault, and Robbery Unit.
I knew that they were going to be in this crime scene for hours and hours and hours. This immediately is what we identify as a forensic case. There was very little disturbed by them when they found the bodies, so we were very fortunate in that respect.
Investigators frequently find evidence in common household dirt. Sometimes hair and fibers buried in carpeting can be traced to a suspect. For thorough coverage, investigators broke each room into quadrants and vacuumed each section. To begin the painstaking task, investigators must first cordon off a 3-foot by 4-foot area of the room. The investigator uses an ordinary vacuum with a special filter attachment. As the debris is pulled off the floor, it travels down a short tube and then goes into a collection point. There it becomes trapped in clean filter paper. Once a quadrant of the room has been processed, the filter is removed and placed into an evidence container. Many minute hairs and fibers are missed by crime scene vacuumings. Therefore, a portable argon laser is used, which causes unseen hairs and fibers to fluoresce when exposed to the laser's light.
Package that.
Let's not lose any of this, okay?
That's
Ready?
sure, got it.
A technique called luminol processing was also used to look for traces of blood. If present, the luminol spray will cause the proteins in the blood to fluoresce, making them visible to examiners.
We were processing the scene and looking for invisible traces or invisible blood patterns. And we found a luminescent impression that we were able to photograph. We also knew we had a knife missing out of the kitchen. We took one of those knives out of the knife set, and we found that matched in width and length to that of the luminol impression that we had.
Go ahead and check the bathroom.
The crime scene appearance suggested the murderer had taken the victims by surprise.
Check this washcloth before we package it up, okay? Make sure there's nothing inside of it.
It appeared that Newman's morning routine was suddenly interrupted, perhaps indicating that they knew the killer.
Okay, excellent. Good job. Go ahead and mark that in.
A big question was motive. At the scene, Cheryl told police that Nancy seemed to have no enemies. As a waitress, she was popular among her customers and colleagues, friendly without being flirtatious. And what possible motive could explain the rage inflicted upon 8-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Angie?
Did you have a good time tonight?
Burglary was unlikely. It was obvious to investigators that the apartment had not been ransacked or otherwise disturbed. Investigators struggled to find a solid lead. Detective Bill Reeder worked the case from the beginning.
The initial lead came from the scene itself, that we could find no signs of forced entry. So that kind of leaned us toward looking at people that had access to the apartment or knew the victims.
Immediately the questioning began. Neighbors, family and friends, anyone who may have had information.
What we were looking at was to find someone that had seen anything unusual, any strangers in the area, had heard anything unusual, had seen someone carrying things away, anything at all that would help us focus on someone or somebody.
Family members are almost always suspects early in an investigation. Paul Chapman was no exception. Though he had no one to back up his alibi, which was that he was alone most of Saturday, his reaction to discovering the bodies was clearly one of trauma and loss. Investigators spoke with everyone close to the family. and learned that Nancy Newman was happily married to John Newman, the father of their 2 girls. He was a suspect, spouses usually are. But John Newman was in California training to be a locksmith at the time of the murders.
Another way to eliminate a suspect is to watch and continue to talk to him. John never gave us any indication other than he wanted this case solved. He was extremely distraught, gave all the signs that anybody would give under the circumstances.
Because the Newmans lived in a multi-unit apartment complex, Detective Grimes knew that interviewing neighbors in the immediate area would be a daunting task.
There was an apartment in a multi-unit apartment house, which was in a particular area of town that was surrounded by large multi-unit apartment houses, and we were looking at literally hundreds of dwellings in that area.
The close-knit community of Anchorage was shocked by the brutality of the murders. Police investigators, having no experience with crimes this shocking, were asking the most frightening of all possible questions. Was a serial killer a possibility? Police felt pressured to work quickly.
For what kind of person would do this kind of crime? Was there significance in the way the people were murdered that could give us some kind of leads as to who we were looking for, or at least what type of person? And so immediately, I'd say within the first day or so, we were getting some help from the FBI.
Investigators quickly realized they needed help in determining the type of individual responsible for the murders. They turned to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia. Special Agent Judd Ray received the call. As a profiler in the unit, Ray's job was to assist investigators in hunting down America's worst killers. To do that, Ray had to understand the workings of a killer's mind.
We were looking at deeds and acts of individuals after it happened and trying to predict the kind of personality, if you will, a composite view of what kind of human being could have done it.
Through detailed evaluations of crime scene photos and police reports, Ray provided investigators with a psychological portrait of the killer.
This is a disorganized crime scene. I mean, you know, low self-esteem, all the kinds of things that you would say about this kind of person. You know, that society has rejected him through the years, and now it's his time to reject society.
Ray told the Anchorage detectives that they possibly faced a repeat performance.
This particular incident alarmed him so much, particularly with 3 victims at one time, 2 being children, that his opinion also, he said that we need to get something working on this right away, because it appears that this person's out of control, and there's the potential that he's going to be doing it again in the very near future.
From the autopsy reports, investigators learned that Nancy and 8-year-old Melissa Newman had been sexually assaulted. Based on this information and characteristics of the crime, Ray concluded that this violent offender would have a history of sexual assault. He would be a white male in his early to mid-20s, an underachiever. Following Ray's conclusions, investigators began to narrow the range of possible suspects. Among them was a young man who had recently moved in a few doors down from the Newmans. Police also questioned Kirby Anthony, the 23-year-old nephew of John Newman. Anthony had an alibi into the morning hours of Saturday, March 14th, but the neighbor did not.
There was a tremendous rage that was inflicted on the almost decapitated the young 3-year-old. Suggested that to me that there's nothing in my mind that I had came across that would have been sufficient on its face to justify this kind of rage by a stranger.
Ray's insistence that the killer was known to the victims led investigators to shift focus away from the man who lived nearby. Neighbors and friends of the Newmans confirmed the young man's claim that he had never met Nancy Newman or her children.
Because I had talked about familiarity, somebody that's close to the family, somebody that knows her, that had some sort of relationship with her, perhaps even been rejected by her. They said, well, as a matter of fact, there's a nephew that comes to mind.
As investigators continued questioning possible suspects, the volume of evidence that had been collected from the crime scene was taxing the limits of Alaska's state crime lab. Once again, Anchorage police turned to the FBI. The evidence was sent to the FBI's crime lab in Washington, D.C. Hair and fiber expert Doug Diedrich was given the case. Diedrich began by sorting through the evidence, searching for any link to a suspect. Hairs, fibers, glass particles, soil, paint chips, anything that may have been transferred during the killer's violent contact with his victims.
Altogether, I believe I looked at over 300, close to 400 items of evidence from the crime scene, from the victims, from elimination samples from different people, both suspect and relatives and possible acquaintances.
Fibers are unusually difficult to trace, and because no one knew what the killer was wearing during the murders, there was no basis in which to compare recovered fibers.
The varieties that are out there are endless, so that when an individual in a case, for instance, who is wearing a particular type of clothing transfers fiber material, that evidence will be considered to be unique. Even though they may have made a number of garments of the same type, by the time it gets out into the public, this material is dispersed like a drop of oil in the ocean. It's there, but it's hard to find.
Distinct fibers, amounting to less than a thimbleful of evidence, were recovered from throughout the Newman's apartment. Diedrich's expertise of fiber transfer, however, enabled him to reconstruct the suspect's movements during the crime, giving investigators a clearer picture of what actually transpired in the apartment. As Diedrich's analysis progressed, Anchorage police asked Kirby Anthony to come to the police department to give more detailed statements. They began to learn more of his story.
And Rose?
Anthony and his girlfriend had moved from Twin Falls, Idaho to Anchorage 18 months earlier. Both had stayed at the Newmans for a while, but were asked to leave about the time they found jobs on a fishing boat.
And I'm grateful, but we're not married.
He and his girlfriend split up while working on the boat after Kirby accused her of having an affair with the skipper. His mates described him as irrational and unstable after the breakup. He clashed with the skipper and was fired. He returned to Anchorage alone on February 14th, 1987. Having nowhere else to go, Anthony took a taxi from the airport straight to the Newmans. Through Cheryl Chapman's continued assistance, police learned that John Newman was upset over his nephew's return to the Newman household during his absence. At the same time, the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Nancy. After a few weeks, she asked Anthony to leave. He moved in with an acquaintance, Dan Grant. As the investigation began to focus on Kirby Anthony, Sergeant Grimes recalled his first encounter with him. The day of the murders, Detective Grimes took on the task of notifying Anthony about the deaths.
I told him that we had some bad news for him, that his aunt and her two little girls had been found dead just earlier that morning. As I recall, Kirby grabbed his hair and started wailing and moaning, but it was all dry-eyed. There was no tears.
Anthony's demeanor did not fit that of a grieving family member. But Grimes knew that Anthony's odd behavior would never justify an arrest.
Well, I know I was.
The autopsy report, however, made investigators more suspicious. Autopsy results helped pinpoint the murders between 7 a.m. and noon on Saturday, March 14th.
What we're able to demonstrate is that the murders happened early in the morning, after the victims had gotten up in the morning. One of the victims had had a bowl of cereal. The other was in the process of eating some cereal. The mother was in the process of having a cup of coffee.
Establishing the time of the deaths made Anthony's alibi irrelevant, which was that he was at an all-night party until early that Saturday morning. He admitted that he drank, smoked some marijuana, and did cocaine.
Hey man, wake up! Get up, man!
He said he returned to the house he shared with Dan Grant at about 7 a.m., then left again at about 8:45 a.m. Meanwhile, FBI agent Diedrich's investigation into fiber and hair evidence was growing more complicated.
One of the items that had come in consisted of vacuum sweepings. At least there were several vacuum sweepings from different rooms. Those items have to be processed and hairs have to be prepared from that. What was, I think, probably the most difficult aspect of this case for me was in trying to account for every hair that was found in that residence. And that's something that's not usually done and seen as there are often too many hairs to deal with. But in this case, it was a monumental task to do that.
Each hair displays its own peculiar characteristics under a microscope, making it possible to trace its likely origin.
The fact that hairs will differ from person to person is very evident when you magnify these characteristics upwards of 250, 400 times.
To examine the fibers and hairs collected at the scene, Diedrich used two high-powered comparison microscopes connected by an optical bridge, one for known material and the other for material yet to be identified. Because Anthony had lived with the Newmans for a while, his hair was likely to be in the apartment. That meant it was important to establish whether the trace hairs were old or recent. So Diedrich went through the contents of the vacuum used in the Newman household.
Because of the vast quantities of hairs and other items that were found in the bag, I had to look at the vacuum bag from a layer standpoint. That is, what was the most recently deposited or recently vacuumed material.
Since Kirby Anthony had denied being in the Newmans' apartment recently, it was imperative that Diedrich determine the condition of the hairs.
The condition of the surface of hairs, the condition of the ends, the roots, will often indicate how long a hair may have been in a particular environment.
Working his way through the layers of the Newmans' vacuum bag, Diedrich found some of the same types of hairs that did not appear to belong to any of the Newmans. These hairs had been recently deposited. In addition to the vacuum sweepings, unidentified pubic hairs were also found on the victims and inside their bedrooms. To determine the significance of these findings, Diedrich now wanted to know how hairs usually are transferred from one room to another. So he conducted his own experiment.
It was a question as to how likely would it be to find somebody's hairs, say pubic hairs, in different areas of a home. So I designed a little experiment where I took a vacuum home, crime scene vacuum, to my house and vacuumed 4 bedrooms over a 2-week period, same time every day, just to see what types of hairs might be found. I was focusing mainly on pubic hairs.
Diedrich preserved the material from every sweeping. He then compared the hairs from those sweepings with known hairs from himself. Diedrich was able to conclude that the hairs did migrate from room to room, mostly by sticking to socks or other clothing. The hairs deposited at the beginning of the experiment were deeper in the vacuum debris and therefore more damaged. The more recently deposited ones were not. The finding was significant to Diedrich. Since Cheryl told police that Nancy vacuumed her house Friday, the unidentified hairs found on the victims would have been deposited right at the time of the murders. Under microscopic scrutiny, an important piece of evidence was revealed. A pubic hair with a partial egg casing, the kind associated with genital lice, was clinging to the damp washcloth found in the Newman's bathroom. Diedrich told investigators of his findings and waited for a sample from a suspect in order to make a comparison. There were at least a half a dozen individuals who were considered prime suspects. Investigators received lists from the State Corrections Department of people recently released who had a history of sex crimes or violence. Some of them were living in the area close to the Newmans. To eliminate these individuals as suspects, each one was extensively questioned and all of their alibis were checked out. Police continued to question Anthony. He admitted nothing. But with each interview, the details of where he was and what he did the morning of the murders changed slightly.
That was kind of an indicator of what we were going to be dealing with Kirby from the get-go, was these little lies that weren't necessary but were thrown out to us.
Unaware of Diedrich's hair analysis, Anthony was asked by investigators to submit hair and blood samples. Wanting to appear cooperative, he voluntarily submitted the samples. They were rushed to Diedrich for comparison. The next day, Diedrich notified investigators that Anthony had pubic lice.
Well, that was probably the most significant breakthrough. At that point, we could start focusing on Kirby as the suspect.
When confronted with the evidence of the hair and egg casing on the washcloth, Anthony admitted that he did have lice. He said he had showered at the Newmans a week before the murders so as not to spread the pubic lice at Dan Grant's house. For Judd Ray, the dirty washcloth left at the crime scene told much about the suspect. The killer had cleaned himself at the murder scene. Why take the risk? Why not go home?
It was obvious to me that he had to go somewhere where he couldn't go there all bloody, which sort of got into this guy's not a loner living alone somewhere.
Ray's behavioral profile also predicted the killer would have been associated with a previous sexual assault. This prediction prompted investigators to look deeper into Kirby's past. They learned that Kirby Anthony had been the central suspect in an Idaho case that remains open to this day. The victim, a 12-year-old girl, suffered brain damage in the attack and was unable to testify.
He had just previous to coming to Alaska, been the focus of police attention down there. They had some type of outdoor picnic outing, and There was a 12-year-old that was found in the woods. She had been strangled, unconscious, near death, and she had been sexually assaulted. Their investigation pointed right at Kirby Anthony.
Ray also predicted the killer would want to appear cooperative with police.
They told us that the suspect would interject himself into the investigation. He would call to find out what the evidence was showing, and Kirby started doing that.
What investigators did not share with Anthony was that Diedrich's other hair comparisons were also pointing to Anthony. The pubic hair found on the washcloth was only one of many positive associations Diedrich was able to make between hairs found at the crime scene and those submitted by Anthony.
And in this case, a number of pubic hairs that were like Kirby Anthony's were found in the rooms, both the victims' rooms, the two girls, and as well as a couple of them that were similar to his on the bed of the mother.
A hair from Anthony's head also was found on the top sheet of Nancy Newman's bed. Facial hairs that matched Anthony's beard were found on all of the victims and in their rooms. The vacuum sweepings from Melissa's room contained 9 of Anthony's pubic hairs. The sweepings from Angie's room included 2 pubic hairs, one with blood and one with lice casings. Investigators felt it was time to keep tabs on Anthony's movements. Through surveillance, investigators learned of Anthony's hangouts and discreetly followed him around town. They hoped that Anthony would reveal something to his friends that would further implicate him in the murders. If he did, the investigators would soon find out. The effort paid off. One of Anthony's acquaintances told investigators that he was writing poetry on napkins and passing the poems around the table. He told one of the women that Nancy Newman had been forced to watch part of the assault.
It was my aunt, 2 nieces.
Investigators also learned that at one point after the murders, Anthony called his ex-girlfriend's mother in Idaho to tell her about the crime. Angie Newman had been stabbed, he said, and Nancy and Melissa sexually assaulted. In both instances, the call to Idaho and the scene at the bar, Anthony could not yet have known about the details he described.
He must have read a different article.
The information had not been released by police to the press, nor had investigators mentioned it to Anthony during questioning.
Pretty sick. I don't remember those details. You did?
Since the surveillance was not a 24-hour-a-day tactic, they would often drive by his house to see if his vehicle was parked out front. If he was home, investigators would often ask him to answer some questions. The circumstantial evidence against Anthony was mounting. During a visit to his residence, investigators noticed a manually operated camera belonging to John Newman that had been reported missing after the murders. He told detectives that the Newmans lent it to him, but when asked later to demonstrate how it worked, he seemed to have no idea how to operate it. Another item missing from the Newman house seemed to be traceable to Anthony. The tip money missing from the cookie tin consisted only of coins. 3 of Anthony's friends told police they either saw him rolling coins into wrappers or saw him pay for items with wrapped coins. And then there were the prints. Anthony's palm print was found on the wall over the bed where Melissa Newman had been assaulted. Prints found on the empty cookie tin on the kitchen table matched Anthony's. His prints were also found on the living room closet door and the inside and outside of the apartment door.
Another place we located one of Kirby's fingerprints was on the back side of the door to the mother's bedroom. And again, its position was significant in that it led us to believe that perhaps someone was trying to escape out of the room, and he already had some other trace evidence on his hand. He slammed the door shut, transferring not only his fingerprint, but some of the other trace evidence that was found in the scene.
The evidence was overwhelming. Every suspect in the month-long investigation had ultimately been cleared, except Kirby Anthony.
Appreciate that.
Well, when you got home, was there anyone there?
For investigators, it was time to obtain an arrest warrant.
And when you got home?
Judd Ray had previously cautioned investigators that the killer might try to flee if the pressure became too much. The increasing intensity of police questioning had made Anthony nervous. Judd Ray was right again. Anthony confided to his roommate, Dan Grant, that he was leaving town. He asked his friend not to tell police. Grant was afraid to contact Anchorage police because of Anthony's notorious temper.
Second precinct task.
Nonetheless, he did finally call them 7 hours later.
Okay.
Anthony was heading to the Canadian border, an 8-hour drive away, and he had a 7-hour head start. Anchorage and the Canadian border are separated by hundreds of miles of uninhabited wilderness. Anthony could be hiding anywhere. Anchorage police quickly contacted U.S. Customs at the Alaska-Canada border. They described Anthony in his vehicle and told the custom official that Anthony was a suspect in a triple homicide. They were hoping he was on his way. Less than an hour later, Anthony arrived at U.S. Customs. Having no idea that investigators had been tipped off, Anthony calmly pulled up to the customs gate.
Step out of the car. Could you get out of the car, please?
He was detained and questioned until Alaska State Troopers arrived. He was arrested for driving on a suspended license and returned to Anchorage.
Thanks a lot for the hospitality there.
As he was turned over to the Anchorage police, he was read his rights and charged. 3 counts first-degree murder, 2 counts sexual assault, and 1 count kidnapping. Under Alaska law, kidnapping can be charged if a victim is restrained during an assault. Melissa Newman had been tied up during the attack.
He jumps up and screaming, "What is this kidnapping stuff?" Which struck us as odd because here he was charged with 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of sexual assault, and he's screaming about the kidnapping charge.
By this time, the forensic evidence was complete enough that police believed they could reconstruct how Angie, Melissa, and Nancy were brutally murdered. The last time Cheryl Chapman saw her sister alive was Friday, March 13th. Cheryl, Paul, and Nancy had each arrived separately at the restaurant where Nancy worked to meet for drinks. Cheryl's daughter, Kelly, had taken Nancy's girls swimming, so the adults had a night out. Paul Chapman had to leave the restaurant early to pick up his son, but planned to meet them later at Nancy's apartment. As they were leaving, Cheryl suggested that Nancy leave her car at the restaurant and ride home with her. Nancy had Saturday off, and Paul would gladly give her a ride back to her car tomorrow.
I don't know. I never pay attention to. You're in, what, 11:30?
Yeah. What time you come in?
11.
11?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead.
Cheryl, Paul, and Nancy all ended up at the Newmans' apartment to wait for Kelly and the
I said,
girls.
you don't see me every day.
They sat, laughing and talking, until about 9:45 when the girls came home. Kelly had treated them to hamburgers. At about 10 p.m., Cheryl and Paul were ready to leave. Cheryl helped Nancy clear the table and put the used coffee mugs in the sink. Angie was already in her pajamas, and Melissa had gone to her room to get ready for bed.
Just sit him right there. Yeah.
As they said goodnight, Paul told Nancy to call him the next day if she wanted a ride back to her car. Sometime between 7 a.m. and noon on Saturday, March 14th, Kirby Anthony arrived at the Newmans' apartment. Kirby Anthony is the only person who knows what happened next. Perhaps Nancy refused to lend him money. Perhaps she refused a sexual advance. Perhaps she ordered him out of the apartment. In any case, his anger boiled over. Evidence indicated that part of the assault on Melissa occurred in her mother's room. Both would have had to have been restrained, and their bodies did show signs of having been bound.
We are able to show through serological findings that Melissa, the 8-year-old, had been assaulted in the mother's bedroom and that she had crossed the bed and was actively bleeding at the time. And then she is subdued somehow and held in a position in that room for a period of time.
Melissa Newman probably witnessed the rape and murder of her mother. She then was taken back to her bedroom where she was assaulted again and killed. The knife used to kill little Angie was never recovered. It was unclear whether she was killed first or last. What was certain was that she seemed to be the target of a horrible, uncontrolled rage. Nancy Newman did not call Paul Chapman the next day for a ride to her car, nor did she answer the phone when her sister tried to reach her repeatedly. Instead, she and her 2 daughters lay dead nearly a full day before their bodies were discovered. The particular grudge against Angie may have grown out of the few times that Anthony babysat the girls. Reportedly, he had called her a tyrant. But for those close to the victims, and for investigators working the case, nothing could explain Kirby Anthony's savagery.
I don't really think that you could isolate any one thing that would cause a man to fly into the homicidal rage like Kirby Anthony did. Yeah, for the most part, you know, I don't think that Kirby Anthony could even tell you why he would do something like that.
A grieving John Newman sat in stony silence throughout his nephew's trial. After 8 weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict on June 3, 1988. A clean-shaven Anthony seemed confident as he waited for the verdict. As each guilty verdict was read, Anthony's composure disintegrated until finally it shattered completely. He was sentenced to 357 years for his crimes. Kirby Anthony's conviction represented an almost textbook example of cooperative police work. Anchorage police provided the FBI with evidence collected from a meticulously preserved crime scene.
Oh, yeah?
Doug Diedrich carefully analyzed the hairs and fibers and anticipated Kirby Anthony's excuses, conducting his own home experiment to refute them. Judd Ray helped police stay several steps ahead of Anthony's thoughts and actions. And for the first time, testimony of an FBI profiler was accepted in court.
It was a good case to test the waters in terms of whether or not this was going to be accepted in our judicial system. And for that, the implications are probably far-reaching. Because it opened the door.
In 1982, a California Highway Patrol officer pulled a young woman over for speeding. He bullied her into sex and then killed her. He then used a decade of police experience to try to cover up his crime and convince local investigators of his innocence. But would he get away with it?
Society depends on trust and authority. It's a system that works. And because it works, we hardly think about it. A uniformed officer demands respect, and we willingly comply. But what if that trust were betrayed? What if a police officer abuses his authority? George Gwaltney was one such cop. The popular and decorated California Highway Patrol officer committed the ultimate violation. He murdered. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When good cops go bad, the full power of law enforcement rallies to repair the damage, rebuild the trust, and deliver justice. The Gwaltney case taxed the resources of both state police and the FBI. He was a cunning adversary, trained in crime solving, and he knew how to cover his tracks.
23-year-old Robin Bishop had left her home in Las Vegas to visit a friend in Los Angeles.
But then you gotta carry trays, so you gotta work on yours.
Robin had hopes of becoming an actress. Her friend convinced her that if she was serious about acting, she had to move to LA.
Okay, let's see.
Robin headed back to Vegas to pack up and make the move. She was excited about her future. In Barstow, California, she stopped to call her mother and get a sandwich. Returning to her car, she fell under the gaze of a predator, California Highway Patrolman George Gwaltney. Though he was a highly respected officer and member of the community, Gwaltney had a secret history of stopping women for speeding and then soliciting them for sex in exchange for getting out of a ticket. The night of January 11th, 1982 was no different. He quickly memorized the make and model of her car. He also noticed the Nevada license plate. Next, Gwaltney saw a neighborhood boy he knew, a boy who, if necessary, could be used as a convenient alibi.
Hey, Preston, you want a ride?
He picked up Preston Olson and gave him a ride home. A former winner of the Officer of the Year award, Gwaltney was well known for such kind actions. Barstow parents trusted Gwaltney to keep a protective eye on their children. He dropped Preston off at his house and said hello to his parents. By now, the young woman whom Gwaltney had targeted would be well out of town, headed toward Nevada on Interstate 15. The ordinarily well-traveled highway was unusually quiet. He caught up with her on the empty highway east of Barstow. He turned on his light and siren and pulled her over. Robin Bishop had a string of tickets for speeding. She had in fact just finished a year of probation and had been given a warning that another ticket would cost her her license. Robin knew that a car and a driver's license would be essential for an aspiring actress in Los Angeles.
Okay, do you have any idea how fast you were going?
Pretty bad.
It's a little bit too fast. I'm gonna have to ask for your license, man. Okay, Robin, I'm gonna have to ask you to get out of the vehicle and follow me back to my squad car.
She left the keys in the ignition and her purse in the car.
Let's take a little walk back to the squad car.
Robin was probably surprised to be taken back to the patrol car, but she obeyed. Unfortunately, Gwaltney had more than a speeding ticket in mind.
Go ahead and turn around for chance on your head. I'm gonna have to cuff you. Kick you in.
For speeding?
Yep, that's the law.
I was just speeding.
Gwaltney stood her up against the patrol car and handcuffed her. As he put her into his back seat, she must have been scared and confused. Why the handcuffs? Where was he taking her? Gwaltney returned to her car to get her purse. At that moment, a car with a lone driver passed by. Gwaltney retrieved the purse, returned to his car, and pulled away, leaving her car abandoned on the interstate shoulder. He drove Robin to an exit that led to a seldom-used access road running parallel to the highway. It was a place he often went to take a break during his patrol shift, a secluded lookout point where he could observe the highway some 400 feet away, clearly from all directions. There, holding the threat of jail or loss of license over her, Gwaltney raped Robin Bishop. When he was done with her, he radioed in a wants and warrants check on Robin's car as if it were abandoned. He knew he'd been spotted walking towards Robin's empty car.
Yeah, I'd like to report a 2829. Yeah, license number 561 FBD.
It was the first in a long line of lies covering his actions for the official record.
Copy that. 10-4.
Things were working out for Gwaltney. He'd gotten what he was after and was simply going to let her go. But as she sat on the ground to put on her boots, something happened. Perhaps anger replaced fear now that she was released. Perhaps she threatened him with exposure. Her brother was a prosecutor in Nevada. Regardless, it would be her word against his. But then, as he stood next to his vehicle, he was suddenly caught in the spotlight of a passing deputy sheriff's car. The deputy may well have noticed Gwaltney's patrol car from the highway nearby. Gwaltney could not know whether he had been recognized. Suddenly, Robin's threats became more real. How could he explain being out there on the access road? In a moment of panic, Officer George Gwaltney decided Robin had to be silenced. Gwaltney took a final and irrevocable step. Now, there was no way to distance himself from the dead girl. Frantic, he devised a way out. He called the dispatcher and reported finding a dead body, a possible suicide. Knowing he had only moments before other officers would arrive at the scene, he searched under her head for the bullet that had killed her. As evidence, the bullet had the power to destroy him, but there was no exit wound. Homicide Detective Milt Rose of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was sent to investigate the dead body found by Gwaltney. On his way to the crime scene, the dispatcher asked that he examine the abandoned car. As the body had been found a short distance away on the access road and was visible to investigators already at the crime scene, the police suspected there was a connection between the car and the body.
I did not see any obvious signs of any malfunctions. No mechanical breakdowns. The tires were all in good condition. The vehicle was in gear. The keys were inside the vehicle. Why did the vehicle stop at the location it was at?
At the crime scene, Officer Gwaltney was now composed and professional. He described how he found the victim, checked for a pulse, and looked in her purse for identification. The Nevada vehicle registration and driver's license identified her as Robin Bishop, owner of the abandoned car he had called in earlier. Although Officer Gwaltney had reported an apparent suicide, Detective Rose quickly ruled out that possibility. The victim had been shot in the back of the head at close range, then moved slightly. 4 inches from her head was a stream of blood on the ground. Clearly, this was a homicide. Recent rainfall made tracks and footprints from Gwaltney and his cruiser clearly visible in the damp sand.
In this general area, we found a couple of footprints that appear to come around the front of the vehicle. They travel around in the front of the vehicle and off in a direction sorted towards the middle area of the vehicle. We travel over here into an area about where this bush is located, or right in this general area, and that's where Robin Bishop's body was found. The other footprints that we found were leading from the driver's door on the highway patrol unit to an area towards the front of the vehicle and then over towards Robin's body, kind of facing off in the easterly direction.
The first officer arriving on the scene criticized Gwaltney for the profusion of his footprints, a clear contamination of the crime scene and uncharacteristically sloppy work.
Why are you going to do this? You need to come to the crime scene out here.
Further examination, I noticed what appeared to be marks on her wrist.
The marks were familiar to any police officer. 2 thin marks across the top of her wrist and 1 across the bottom, typical of those made by handcuffs. Then, when Detective Rose examined the contents of the victim's purse, he could find no signs of robbery, but the vehicle registration and driver's license were lying on top of the purse's contents, as if they'd been shown to someone and quickly thrown back into the purse.
It indicated to me that we needed to take a look at some type of vehicle stop where somebody in some type of position of authority possibly stopped this car.
To Rose, the evidence pointed to the involvement of a police officer or someone posing as one. Every investigator at the crime scene was either a friend or a colleague of Officer Gwaltney. That he might be connected with the crime was not even considered at this point. An autopsy was performed. The results confirmed that the body had been moved slightly after being shot, and that the bruises were in fact made by handcuffs. The fatal bullet was found lodged in Robin's jaw. Though it was the caliber of a standard police service revolver, the brand was not the standard ammunition. The autopsy also showed that she had had sex within 24 hours of her death, but there were none of the normal physical signs of a forcible rape.
The first thing we needed to do was to eliminate people that had been to the scene or could have been in the area. Other highway patrol officers, other deputies, whoever was in that particular area around that time frame. We needed to start with Officer Gwaltney to begin with, because Officer Gwaltney was a person who found the body.
Gwaltney's survival depended on staying one step ahead of the investigation. When he finished his shift that night, he struggled to remove the gun barrel from the murder weapon. It was the one piece of hard evidence that could conclusively implicate him in the crime. Gwaltney knew his gun barrel left identifiable markings on the bullet that killed Robin Bishop. The next morning, he went to a local gun shop to order a new barrel, which would confuse a ballistics test. But the barrel was not in stock and had to be ordered. Then he took his uniform to the dry cleaner and his holster to the repair shop for re-dyeing and restitching. All that remained was to stall for time until the gun barrel arrived. In Barstow, Rose held a briefing that morning with the police and sheriff departments to discuss the case. He asked all officers on duty the night before to turn in their weapons so that ballistics tests could eliminate them as possible suspects in the crime. Gwaltney made sure to attend. During the briefing, he learned that the fatal bullet had been recovered. By early evening, Gwaltney was the only officer who had not turned in his weapon for testing. The detectives went to his home and asked for his service revolver. He returned moments later with the wrong gun, his off-duty weapon.
George, this isn't your service revolver, and that's what we need. Your service revolver.
Yeah, service. Everyone else.
The captain sent him back for his service revolver, but he returned empty-handed.
You aren't going to believe this, but it's been stolen.
What do you mean stolen?
Well,
George,
there's been some burglaries in the
He
neighborhood.
claimed that his house must have been burglarized. The gun was missing.
have to ask for your
The story sounded doubtful,
formality.
but because Gwaltney was a highway patrol officer, Detective Brian English with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was inclined to believe him.
I kind of empathized with him because we were, in my opinion, we were looking for evidence to show that he didn't do it. It was some criminal that did it. You know.
Gwaltney agreed to come to headquarters for questioning. But first, the detectives searched his locker for the missing weapon. They found nothing.
Then we sat down and we started talking with Officer Gwaltney. And to him, it didn't appear important that his gun was gone, which was very significant. And if I was in his position, I'd have been extremely worried, and it didn't seem to bother him.
By now, it was almost 2 days after the crime. The missing weapon and Gwaltney's odd behavior made it impossible to deny the obvious. Gwaltney was advised of his constitutional rights. Although this made him the primary suspect in the case, there was insufficient evidence to actually arrest him. Insisting he was innocent, Gwaltney agreed to give a tape-recorded interview.
That we can record on tape about the night that Robin was shot. Yeah, I have no problem with that.
He said he'd worked his regular beat patrolling the interstate on January 11th. After his dinner break, he had picked up a young boy he knew, Preston Olson, whom he had seen walking home alone. After dropping Preston off at his house, he was by 8:50 p.m. back on the interstate. About 9:15, he found the abandoned car, ran a stolen vehicle check, then turned onto the access road. Seeing a pale shape, he had pulled over. It was the body of the victim, Robin Bishop.
he was not reacting normally for a person who had been accused of committing this kind of a crime. Had it been me, I would not be talking to them. I'd tell them to prove it. I'd be very irate. I'd be very upset.
Officer Gwaltney had repeatedly insisted on taking a lie detector test. He reiterated his statement and then answered a series of critical questions, including the direct question, had he killed Robin Bishop?
No.
The examiner could find no sign of deception in the polygraph exam. Gwaltney had just crossed another hurdle in his cover-up.
We transported George from the Barstow station back down to San Bernardino for further questioning. At that time, George gave his consent to go ahead and search his house.
Sheriff's deputies investigated Gwaltney's claim that his house must have been burglarized, but they could find no sign of forced entry. The homicide detectives then began their work. At dawn, they found the frame of a Smith & Wesson Model 19 .357 Magnum revolver inside Gwaltney's truck. The frame was badly damaged with tool marks. It appeared to have been dismantled by someone who had no knowledge of how to take it apart.
The barrel, which would have been used for a ballistics comparison, was gone. Therefore, there's no ballistics match could be done.
The gun frame was registered to George Michael Gwaltney. To the detectives, it had been dismantled for only one purpose. Gwaltney was placed under arrest. But the evidence was still only circumstantial. A link between the revolver and the tools used to dismantle it had to be found. The detectives returned to Gwaltney's home for another search. Evidence was collected. Gripping-type tools and a pipe vise found behind the garage that showed fresh signs of metal transfer. In the bedroom closet, detectives found 5 boxes of bullets bearing the CHP insignia. In the boxes among the standard police rounds, they found 27 bullets of another brand. .357 caliber 158 grain soft points made by Remington Arms, the same kind of bullet that killed Robin Bishop. Gwaltney's wife was in a state of shock and disbelief. When questioned, she assured the detectives again and again that George had not been acting strangely or in any way different lately. He was a good husband and a good father to their children.
He's a wonderful husband, a very caring father.
News of Gwaltney's arrest stunned the small community of Barstow. His fellow officers had known and respected him for decades. Despite the considerable evidence against Gwaltney, they were unable to accept his possible guilt.
Pretty dramatic and emotional thing when another law enforcement officer is accused of committing a murder.
Most of the people knew George, and they could not believe that George Gwaltney could have done something so bad.
I recall a couple of the officers that were close friends of his were in tears when I was interviewing them because they didn't want to believe that George could do this.
Even the investigators struggled to come to grips with the conclusion they had been forced to draw.
My feeling was, he didn't do it. He couldn't do it. He's a highway patrolman.
But the evidence continued to mount. Semen was found in the backseat of Gwaltney's cruiser and in Robin's jeans. A critical report was filed by Sheriff's Deputy Roger Kaufman, who had been out of town the days following the crime and had only just learned of Gwaltney's arrest. He described driving by the exact crime scene area about the time of the murder. From the interstate, he spotted a car's parking lights on the little-used access road. Shining his spotlight on the car, he saw an officer standing by it, but was driving too fast to identify him. Barely minutes later, he heard a very upset Gwaltney calling in a possible suicide on the radio. He'd been surprised to hear Gwaltney, a man known for his unshakable presence, sounding so agitated, but had not given the incident any thought until he learned of the arrest. As the investigation progressed, it became apparent that Gwaltney had used his knowledge of investigative procedure to thwart detectives' efforts to collect evidence against him. His uniform had been dry cleaned, his holster re-dyed and re-stitched, allegedly for an upcoming inspection. Any evidence of blood or tissue transferred from the gun had been destroyed. His footprints had altered the crime scene. When detectives questioned the owners of gun stores in the area on the theory Gwaltney would have tried to buy a replacement barrel for his service revolver, none could recall him being in their stores. After several months of an internal investigation, Gwaltney was fired from the California Highway Patrol.
Okay, bye.
Now convinced that he had committed the worst imaginable crime, detectives were still unable to prove Gwaltney was lying. His wife and friends still solidly supported him. 9 months later, the trial began, with prosecutor Betty Kennedy confident that the considerable evidence, though mostly circumstantial, was strong enough to result in a quick conviction. In his opening statement, defense attorney George Porter told the jury that George Michael Gwaltney was the victim of a frame-up, possibly by someone in his own department. Someone stopped Miss Bishop, as he would show, but it was not George Gwaltney. The defense produced a key witness, railroad worker Dennis Gubler, who testified that he had passed Robin Bishop's empty car on the highway shoulder that night. A light-colored car was parked 50 feet behind it. Gubler described to the jury a man carrying a flashlight who was approaching Bishop's car. His description, however, seemed to eliminate Gwaltney as the man he saw. Other suspects, Porter contended, must be considered. The prosecution constructed a precise and elaborate timeline for the jury, from Robin's final phone call to her mother in Barstow to Gwaltney's radio call reporting the discovery of her body. The timeline included all of Gwaltney's known actions and time for the murder as well. The prosecution believed its case was bulletproof. Travel times, the pickup of the Olsen boy, the deputy's sighting, the radio calls, everything. But Gwaltney's attorney countered by producing dozens of witnesses, CHP colleagues and personal friends who testified to his impeccable character and record. He used the timeline itself to cast doubt on the series of events. Could Gwaltney possibly have had enough time, barely 20 minutes, to do all he was accused of? The defense easily challenged the scientific analysis of the semen samples from the car and the victim. The technology for using DNA in the courtroom was still 6 years in the future. In addition, Porter was able to cast doubt on the prosecution's inconclusive tool mark analysis of the gun frame and tools taken from Gwaltney's vehicle and residence. Nevertheless, the prosecution believed the bullet evidence and the dismantled gun frame would be enough to convince the jury.
The strongest evidence that we had in the particular case was the frame of the gun. How can you explain the frame? How can you explain why it was in the vehicle? Why was it taken apart? Why was the barrel missing? Why was the cylinder missing? The grips, the hammer, the trigger? Why?
Gwaltney was prepared and polished, providing the defense with its best witness, himself.
He had an answer for everything that was questioned to him. And every answer he had was feasible. And what their defense tactic was to put a small amount of doubt into each one of the items of evidence that we presented. And that's what they did. And George did an excellent job of tying up all the loose ends when he testified.
In the end, the testimony of 50 witnesses in 30 areas of expertise and all the accumulated evidence failed to convince the local jury. After 4 days, a deadlock was declared, 8-4 in favor of acquittal. George Gwaltney was a free man.
Nothing is, as some people say, a slam dunk. And you never know which way the jury's going to go. You never know which evidence the judge is going to let in and which evidence the judge won't let in. So because I wasn't involved in the daily routine. I was very much surprised that George was not found guilty.
We spoke to a number of the jurors, and a few of the jurors thought there was a good possibility George was the one responsible, but they couldn't believe he actually did it. And if he did do it, he was a highway patrolman. He worked hard. He worked for the community. He was respected. We just couldn't find him guilty.
Still believing George Gwaltney was guilty, prosecutors were determined to get a conviction. Less than 1 year after the mistrial, Gwaltney was tried again in Superior Court. But with little new evidence presented, the trial ended in another deadlocked jury, 7-5 in favor of acquittal. George Gwaltney walked away, seemingly out of reach of the law.
I was stunned. I sat around for several hours just thinking about rehashing what could have we done to change the outcome. What could we do if and when there's another trial?
Arguing the appearance of harassment, the judge denied prosecutors a third trial. It appeared that George Gwaltney could not be brought to justice in the town of Barstow.
We felt, and I was convinced, that George killed this lady, and that we needed someone to come in and prosecute George. George needed to pay for what happened.
From the moment of Gwaltney's arrest, the FBI had been watching this case with great interest. Anytime a homicide involving a police officer takes place, the FBI monitors the investigation. After Gwaltney was acquitted a second time, there was enormous public pressure to find the truth surrounding Robin Bishop's murder. The FBI's Los Angeles field office decided it was time to intervene. The FBI knew that George Gwaltney could never be tried again for Robin Bishop's murder in the state of California. But in a federal court, he could be charged with violating her civil rights. By killing Robin Bishop while he was on duty, George Gwaltney had committed a federal crime. By taking her life, he had violated her civil rights. This had never been argued in a criminal trial before. But the FBI and federal prosecutors believed the Bishop murder was a perfect test case. The case was assigned to Special Agent Michael Randolph.
Gwaltney was like a wolf in the sheep pen. The local law enforcement didn't know that he was the perpetrator. He was the person that had committed the murder, so he would stay one step ahead of them, destroying evidence. And this is a significant reason that the locals were unsuccessful in their prosecution. They didn't realize what they were dealing with.
Exhaustively reviewing the crime scene photographs, Agent Randolph's attention was caught by a photo. It revealed the contents of the trunk of Gwaltney's patrol car the night of the murder. In it, he spotted a small box of ammunition. He sent the photos off for enlargement and analysis.
We were notified by the FBI laboratory that photographic analysis revealed that that was a box of .357 Magnum ammunition and was in fact illegal ammo of the type that Gwaltney had testified he did not carry and was not carrying the night of the murder. It was also, we believe, the same box of ammo that was collected from his house.
Agent Randolph had just caught George Gwaltney in his first lie.
We knew that he had lied about one thing at the two local trials. There had to be other things that he had lied about.
Working closely with the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department and the California Highway Patrol, Agent Randolph began re-examining virtually all of the evidence from the first two state trials.
Instead of handling it as a usual criminal investigation, we took an exhaustive approach, sort of like a TWA Flight 800 approach. Every rivet had to be looked at, every rock had to be looked at.
The mountain of reports, transcripts, photos, and physical evidence would be painstakingly re-examined by the FBI labs and Bureau field agents.
Key things that were used that we sent back to the lab would include such things as, obviously, the frame of the gun. The frame of the gun had been recovered by the local police, and they had done tool mark analysis but had been unable to show who took the gun apart.
The gun frame was sent back to the Firearms Toolmark Unit of the FBI labs in Washington. Unique in the world, the lab has a collection of over 2,000 guns, from John Dillinger's pistol to the newest military assault rifle. Every bullet manufactured for the last 50 years is here too. Hollow point and steel jacket, 22 to 50 caliber. Like the guns, they're all here for testing and comparison. The soundproof ballistic room allows for comparison firing and bullet retrieval. Comparative microscopes allow for precise analysis of the gun barrels. But the most valuable asset in the lab are the agents, whose long experience in these specialized tests make them invaluable in difficult cases such as the Bishop murder. Jim Cadigan of the FBI Firearms and Toolmark Unit was brought into the case to conduct a toolmark analysis of the gun frame and the 15 different wrenches and tools, including the pipe vise, taken from Gwaltney's home. Steel tools almost always leave behind some distinctive and often microscopic mark after their use, a signature as unique as a fingerprint. The FBI Toolmark Lab is one of the largest, most specialized, and most technologically sophisticated in the country.
It was obvious from the beginning that the individual that had worked on this particular firearm knew something about forensics because he had removed several pieces of the firearm that could be of some use later on to a forensic examiner.
Agent Cadigan approached the very specific task of associating the tool marks on the gun frame with the tool marks made by the 15 gripping tools taken from the Gwaltney home.
The question was, could one of these tools have been used to hold the frame while the barrel of the firearm was being removed? In looking at the frame, I noticed near where the hole was for the pin that locks the barrel down, very near the hole for that, there was a small 1/16 of an inch impression, almost as if it was made by a small screwdriver tip, right below that hole.
This tiny mark matched a small imperfection in one of Gwaltney's tools.
In looking at the tools that were submitted from Gwaltney, I noticed that one of those tools, a pipe wrench, had a broken tooth. And the tooth was broken off in the middle, and then there was a small island of metal left on the tooth. And that looked very similar to the mark that was on the frame. So using that as a pivot point, I started making impressions with that tool and comparing those impressions under a microscope, the tool marks, with the impressions that were on the frame, and was able to come to a conclusion that that particular tool was used to the exclusion of any other tool to make the marks that were found on the frame.
In addition to the tool marks testing, the FBI lab conducted extensive testing on the particular bullets found in the Gwaltney home. The lack of a barrel on Gwaltney's gun made a ballistics test impossible, a problem that had hurt the prosecution in the state trials. So the FBI lab devised a test that had never before been used forensically, a radical new use of nuclear technology in forensic science.
When a manufacturer of lead like Remington Arms makes a batch of lead, they throw things in much as you would when you're making meatloaf. That makes each batch of lead unique. We then took over 200 rounds that the locals had collected when they did their investigation of George Michael Gwaltney. We submitted those to the lab. The lab made those radioactive and got their molecular weight, their chemical fingerprint, and lo and behold, we find approximately 27 rounds that are the exact match as the lead taken from the head of our victim.
The samples in the reactor absorb neutrons and become radioactive. This radioactivity is measured and gives a precise reading of the chemical elements in the lead from the bullet, an atomic fingerprint. The radioactive tests were indisputable. Each of the 27 bullets found in Gwaltney's closet, bullets he had sworn under oath he did not own, had come from the same batch of lead as the bullet that killed Robin Bishop. The FBI lab worked to establish a definite match between Gwaltney's gun frame and his pipe wrench, and between the fatal bullet and the bullets found in his home. Additionally, Agent Randolph constructed psychological portraits of not only George Gwaltney, but Robin Bishop. It was important that the federal jury perceive her as a genuine victim. Robin Bishop was raped by someone she was taught to respect and trust, an officer of the law.
This made it very easy to understand the lack of force of violence that was evident in the crime scene other than the trauma. And she was compliant. She respected law enforcement authority. She's the type of person that pulled over and opened her wallet and handed her and stood out and was handcuffed even though she knew all she had done was a speeding ticket. It made her an easy victim.
In the same way, the FBI examined every aspect of Gwaltney's background to gain an understanding of his behavior around women. By questioning a woman who admitted to having an affair with Gwaltney, it was learned that she would meet him at his regular spot along the isolated highway for sex. The same exit to the access road where he had taken Robin Bishop. Every woman who received a summons from Gwaltney in the last 2 years was contacted, and a pattern emerged. Nearly a dozen women claimed that Gwaltney had solicited them for sex or touched them suggestively.
This indicated to us that this was not an isolated sexual assault with Mr. Gwaltney. This is a type of pattern of behavior. When he put his uniform on, he became predatory towards females, was our conclusion.
Witness testimony from the state trials was also carefully re-examined for discrepancies that could lead to breaks in the case. In some instances, the FBI leaned hard with the weight of federal authority.
Many witnesses were reluctant to testify, fearful. It's a small community, everybody knows everybody. We had to let them know that a federal investigation is just not a local matter that's going to blow away with the wind out in the desert. We're going to be here until this is resolved.
This persistence led to one of the most crucial breakthroughs in the case. San Bernardino Sheriff's detectives had originally interviewed the owners of Barstow gun shops for signs that Gwaltney might have tried to buy a replacement barrel for his service revolver the day after the crime. None claimed to have seen him. One of those interviewed was a Mr. William Addington, owner of the Powderhorn Gun Shop. He had denied during both state trial investigations that George Gwaltney had been in his shop the day after the murder. But printouts from the shop's phone bills caught Addington in a lie.
And we found toll records that show the day after the homicide, late in the afternoon, after the briefing that Gwaltney had attended, Mr. Addington had made a phone call up to this gun shop in Sacramento attempting to order a barrel for the type of weapon that Mr. Gwaltney carried that was now missing the barrel.
Now confronted by the FBI with this evidence, Addington admitted that Gwaltney had been in his store trying to buy a barrel for his revolver the day after Robin Bishop's murder. Addington had previously lied to state investigators in an effort to avoid getting involved. Fearing that lying to the FBI was a felony, Addington broke down. Reviewing the timeline of events, the FBI found that Gwaltney had created a false alibi to cover his visit to the gun shop and shoe repair shop where he'd had his holster cleaned and dyed, claiming to be on duty at the time. Gwaltney's story was falling apart. But the most important part of the timeline that the FBI reviewed was the pickup and delivery of the neighborhood boy Preston Olson.
The problem with that story was nobody had ever sat down with Preston Olson. He testified at 2 trials, and he verified what Gwaltney said.
But as the FBI went over the events with Preston and his mother, minute by minute, they realized that Officer Gwaltney had actually left the boy's house a half hour earlier than his original testimony.
Preston never owned a watch and had never timed it, and nobody had ever done a timeline analysis with him.
This new information and the resulting revision of the timeline was one of the most important developments in the FBI's case.
We didn't stop for anything. There was no traffic whatsoever.
He can't change his story. He's locked himself in on 2 local trials to the local timeline. So the timeline was very significant. It gives him a half hour he has no explanation for.
With a revised timeline, Officer Gwaltney now had ample time, 20 to 40 minutes, to stop Bishop, handcuff her, force her to have sex with him, then shoot her.
Gwaltney knows she's got out-of-state plates. She's an attractive young blonde woman. He zips up the road, takes him a couple minutes, and then gives chase.
Finally, Dr. Edward Blake of Forensic Science Associates was contacted to re-examine the semen evidence from the first 2 trials. Prior to the use of DNA in criminal trials, the use of semen as evidence was problematic. But the FBI felt there might still be a way to use what they had. Gwaltney had had a vasectomy and had it reversed. Was there any way this information could be used in the identification and matching of his semen with the crime scene specimens? Federal prosecutors asked Dr. Blake, a forensic serologist, if there were any new scientific developments that might help the investigation.
He said, well, I mean, science does progress over time, does it not, Dr. Blake? I mean, maybe there's something, and would you be willing to just look into the matter? And I said, well, I happen to know some people that are involved in fertility work, and one of the elements that's involved in this case is the idea that Mr. Gwaltney had had a vasectomy and had it reversed.
Dr. Blake learned from colleagues at the University of California that a vasectomy reversal can sometimes cause the production of anti-sperm antibodies. The body reacts to sperm seeping into the bloodstream as if it were invading germs. The phenomenon is highly unusual and could conceivably be used as a marker in seminal fluid. He sent samples from Gwaltney to the University of California lab.
We found that not only do those fluids contain the anti-sperm antibodies, the antibodies were there at very, very high levels. And that provided the incentive to then explore the evidence itself.
Dr. Blake learned of a new test used in fertility studies. It was called the immunobead assay test and could determine the presence of anti-sperm antibodies in the crime scene samples. Because this kind of evidence had never been used in court before, Dr. Blake videotaped the test to show the jury in the federal trial.
Ultimately, extracts that were prepared from a pair of genes that were on Robin Bishop's body, samples that were taken from the Highway Patrol car seat were prepared, and these samples were tested for the presence of these anti-sperm antibodies. And in both of those samples, the anti-sperm antibodies were found.
During the 6-month FBI investigation, all of the re-examined evidence and all of the new witness testimony led to one bedrock certainty for the special agents working on the case.
We know we've got the right guy, and we're going to get him.
George Gwaltney was going back to court. George Michael Gwaltney was indicted by a federal grand jury for violating the civil rights of Robin Bishop and arrested. He was the first California law officer to be charged under the federal civil rights statute. Once again, he pleaded not guilty. But for the first time since the ordeal began, Robin Bishop's parents had hopes for a different outcome. This time, George Gwaltney faced a federal court and the FBI. It was clear from the beginning that the federal trial would not be a repeat of the first 2 trials. The federal trial began on January 17, 1984, in the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles. George Gwaltney was represented by public defender Carol Douglas, who chose not to have his client testify. He knew George Gwaltney was in serious trouble.
and then he subsequently murdered her.
Gwaltney knew that we were breaking his alibis, breaking his stories, and that he was going to have to concoct a new story. He had painted himself into a corner, and we were going to use his brush to paint him into a jail cell.
This is a frame-up.
As the trial progressed, the FBI punched a hole in every strong point of Gwaltney's earlier defense. The prosecution told the jury that Gwaltney had marked Robin Bishop as prey the first time he saw her in the fast food restaurant. With the testimony of the other women he had abused, Gwaltney's Officer of the Year image crumbled. After dropping Preston Olson at home, he pulled Bishop over and ordered her into his patrol car. The new testimony now gave him plenty of time. Following an established pattern, he drove to a familiar secluded spot and forced her into a sexual bargain, corroborated by the semen stain on the back seat of his new patrol car. As she sat struggling to put her boots back on, the blinding spotlight of Deputy Kaufman's patrol car hit Gwaltney, placing Gwaltney on the access road with Robin Bishop away from her car. Having no idea of who had seen him or what they had seen, he panicked and killed Robin Bishop. Then he breathlessly called the dispatcher with a possible suicide. The autopsy and the crime scene photos showed that he had not moved her head to check for a pulse. The movement was too great. He was desperately searching for the bullet that killed her, one in a series of actions in which he tried to cover up his crime. That night, Gwaltney roughly removed the barrel from the murder weapon, which left the microscopic tool-marked fingerprints that matched the gun frame with Gwaltney's tools. But perhaps most damning in the courtroom was the controversial immunobead assay test. Videotape of tested samples from Robin's jeans and the car seat show the tiny beads attaching themselves to the sperm.
What you can see in these videotapes for the appropriate specimens, that is, specimens that contain the anti-sperm antibody, is the final stage of the analysis.
Live sperm were shown swimming through the medium with the beads attached, indicating that the antibodies were present in both specimens. Dr. Blake was allowed by the judge only to indicate percentage results of his testing. He testified that Gwaltney's blood type put him in 12% of the population. Of that 12%, only 5% of those would test positive for the presence of anti-sperm antibodies. Less than 1% of the population could possibly have had sexual intercourse with Robin Bishop that night. As much as the defense might argue that the rest of the evidence was circumstantial, the scientific evidence was overpowering. The verdict was returned swiftly.
When the jury walked in, they would not look at Gwaltney, and it was very clear that they had a guilty verdict.
As far as I was concerned, I was pleased and that George had to suffer the consequences of his action, and that Robin Bishop's death didn't go uninvestigated.
It was, it's a case you'll never forget.
You took advantage of a vulnerable person.
The judge gave George Gwaltney the stiffest possible sentence, a maximum federal prison term of 90 years, and a minimum term of 30 years before becoming eligible for parole.
Mr. Gwaltney, you have
12 years
betrayed your
later,
badge.
George Gwaltney died in prison of a heart attack. To the end, he claimed he was innocent and had been the victim of a frame-up.
Diane Jones had gone missing. Where could she be?
Diane Jones was a professional woman, very middle class, well-to-do, respectable. Her husband, Robert Jones, was a well-respected local doctor.
They have
a stormy relationship.
Thank you, dear.
Oh, Diane,
Stop
you know
it!
you want to.
Stop it!
She's dead. Nobody's been charged, nobody's been convicted. Someone's got away with it.
It's very Midsummer Murders, the Diana Jones case. It's thatched cottages and roses round the door. Not the sort of place you expect something like that to happen.
She wasn't a very typical murder victim. This was different because it was a sort of very idyllic setting.
Of all the unsolved murder cases, this one is unique. For 40 years, police hunting the killer of Diane Jones have said that their only suspect was hiding in plain sight. 3 times they submitted evidence seeking to charge her husband, the respectable local GP Robert Jones, with the murder. Each time they were told their evidence was not strong enough.
It is possible for police to become fixated on the wrong person. It's happened before. They become zeroed in on a particular person and they couldn't see any other possibilities.
So what happened 40 years ago to set these extraordinary events in motion?
When Robert Jones was prime suspect that Essex police had for the murder of his wife, perhaps it was somebody else.
"50 miles from central London, Coggeshall is a quaint town of 4,000 people in Essex. The highlight of the year, held every July, is the Coggeshall Summer Carnival. It's been a prosperous farming area since medieval times. There are houses here on sale today for several £1 million. This could be described as quintessential Little England, which is why such a brutal murder shook the community to its foundations. Back in 1983, in a rambling former farmhouse on the outskirts of the town, lived the local GP, Dr. Robert Jones, and his 35-year-old wife, Diane. On the night of Saturday, July the 23rd, the couple visited their favourite local pub, the Woolpack. The doctor said that they drove home, and Diane stepped out of the car.
I drink so I don't have to listen to all
you've got issues.
Then, in the next few moments, she simply vanished.
Robert Jones said that he took her home in the car to the home address where he went in to walk the dog, and when he came out she'd gone. What's clear is that she did get in the car at the pub for the short mile ride home.
Initially the story started with a disappearance. Diane Jones had gone missing. Where could she be? It was rather odd circumstances because she was quite a sort of a middle class, living in a nice area. It wasn't your usual crime victim. And her husband, he was the doctor in the town, quite a respected figure. So there was a lot of interest in this story.
My name is Mike Baldry. I was a detective inspector on the Diane Jones murder inquiry. It's a quiet little place, a charming little place, and everybody knew each other. It was a stunning effect on the whole village because of the intense publicity. All the newspapers, all the major television channels were interested in it.
At that time, there was a lot of investigation, a lot of inquiries into Diane's background, where she could be, people she might have gone off with, perhaps.
How are you treating this case at the moment? As a missing person inquiry. Have you found anything at all? Not at the moment, no. All I will say to you is this, that the circumstances, as I understand them, surrounding her disappearance, give me cause for concern as to her welfare and safety.
She was a tortured soul, there's no doubt about it. I don't suppose I was worldly wise enough to pick up on the real internal turmoil that she was going through. My name's David Wiley, and I knew Diane Jones as a neighbour of mine, and we became friends. She was one of these people who was just, I don't know, she's a victim. Sad, terribly sad. Victim, didn't deserve what happened to her. Not in a million years, no one deserved that. And the really frightening thing for me was that she predicted all of it.
Diane Jones began life far from the prosperous home counties, where her life ended. She was an only child, born in the tiny Lincolnshire village of Tealby.
I knew Diane very well through our teens, and we kept in touch over the years. At the time, it was a very rural village. There was little shops, 2 pubs, very friendly. It's one of those villages whereby everyone seems to look after each other, which is nice, and you tend to look after each other's back. The father, Sidney Walker, he had his own building company, and the mother, which is Phyllis Walker, she was a school teacher. She was a single child, and she was quite adventurous in many ways. Eventually, her father set her up as a hairdresser. There's a back room. They converted it so that she could run a little salon from her home, from their home. There's a few ladies about here which still remember their hair being done by Diane. Yeah, she knew a lot of people. A lot of people knew Diane better, yeah.
We would go to the local pub, the King's Head, and Diane was working behind the bar. A bright, smiley person that you greeted when you came in the pub. I count myself very lucky to have known Diane when I did. She met our friend, Ian, who was godfather to my son, and we got to know her much better then.
There was a chap who came to the pub. His name was Ian Hamilton, and he said, "That's a pretty girl." He says, looking at Diane, you see. And one of the other lads, he says he laid a wager. And he says, I bet you're scared to ask her out. Anyway, he did so, and strangely enough, about a matter of months after that, they were married.
They got married without telling people. They came round to see us to tell us that they were married, which was quite a surprise, but a nice one at the time. They moved down south. Ian got a job down there, and they both moved down. And to start with, they were very happy. She enjoyed parties and things. Ian was a very gentle person, and I think that was what she liked about him. He was her rock, I think.
After moving down from Lincolnshire to Essex, following her wedding, Diane had trained and found a job as a social worker. But the marriage with Ian Hamilton ended in divorce. Then one fateful day, Diane booked an appointment at the small GP surgery in Coggeshall.
Robert Jones met Diane when she presented herself at the surgery. They became an item, had an on-off relationship. Today that would be seen as unacceptable in the workplace, but of course this is 1983 and ethics were very different, but that is how they met, yeah, as she was a patient at the surgery.
At the time they began their affair, Dr. Jones was into his second marriage and had 3 young children. He lived in a rambling former farmhouse known as Lee's Farm, just outside Coggeshall. Once the divorce was out of the way, in September 1982, he and Diane were married and had a baby daughter. But even in this small community, few seemed to know the doctor's new wife.
Back in the early 80s, he was my doctor. He was, extremely nice and pleasant guy. There was a family connection in as much as my 2 children were the same age as Dr. Jones's 2 children, and the wife used to take them on a Saturday to their riding school. But one never knew Mrs. Jones, from my point of view, just never knew her.
But by the time Diane disappeared in July 1983, in some circles the gossip had already started. Most of all at their local, the Woolpack Inn.
I'm not doing this.
They'd been married for less than a year, Dr. Jones for the 3rd time, but their relationship was known to be a stormy one.
Volatile. I say this without prejudice. Volatile. They have...
A stormy relationship.
Thank you, dear.
We had a lot of people come forward to give their recollection of Dr. Jones and Diane Jones. A lot of people knew that the relationship was a pretty volatile one because they had arguments in the local pubs in the village.
If they would fight in public, police began to wonder what might go on behind closed doors. Detectives began to look a little closer at Dr. Jones's account of the night Diane disappeared, Saturday, July the 23rd. They'd spent that night in the Woolpack, and the evening had ended in a blazing row.
You think I drink because I wanted to get drunk? I drink the way
He said he drove back to the farm, parked the car behind the house, and he never saw her again. She disappeared. He looked round for her and she was gone. But he didn't report that straight away. He waited for 9 days until he reported her missing. It wasn't until 9 days later that he went to the police and said, my wife is missing. And that's when the hunt started for Diane.
I remember trying to ring her, so I rang her quite regularly. And for a while, I wasn't getting through, or there was no answer at all.
There was mixed
evidence about what happened that night. There was an area of suspicion around it because of various calls and knowledge of the couple to Essex Police. Robert says that he drove all the way home. What's more in dispute is whether Diane got out of the car on the way home.
The distance from the Woolpack Inn to Lee's farm is less than a mile. A journey that should have taken no more than 4 minutes. But did the car stop on the way?
There are 2 witnesses that saw what they thought was Diane walking down the road a short distance from Lee's farm, going towards Lee's farm. Whether there was some sort of altercation in the car and she got out, whether she got out before she got the home address, we don't know. We never did establish that.
I had a phone call from Robert to say, did I know where she was? Had I seen her? Had I heard from her?
It was in the July of '83 when she was reported as missing. I'd been on holiday, and when I got back, she wasn't there. It was a strange one, but I'd knocked on the door a few times, and she'd just gone. And I never saw her again. I never saw her again.
I got the feeling in the town, and perhaps also from the police, that the person most of interest was Dr. Jones. They did talk to other people, they did follow a lot of avenues, but it all seemed to come back to Dr. Jones.
The whispering was, well, of course, her husband's done away with her, I knew a number of Essex CID officers at the time saying to me privately, you couldn't write it because it would have been libelous. But the police were saying, well, he's done it,
Robert did come and see me after she had been missing for some time to see if I had had any contact with her or anything. And that sort of surprised me at the time.
He was quite a cool character. I think that probably didn't help him in a way, that he came across as very calm, sometimes monosyllabic. Didn't seem, at least to the outside world, hugely stressed. I didn't see him doing any big interviews with posters saying, can you help me find Diane? There was none of that. Doesn't mean to say that he was involved, but it was a facet of how he was viewed, I think, probably by the police and locally.
Essex Police at the time viewed the way that Dr. Jones was behaving as odd. Diane and Robert had 2 cars. One was put up for sale shortly before Diane went missing and was sold afterwards. We did find that car was forensically examined at the time.
It was a Peugeot car that he used to go to the Woolpack that night she disappeared. That was searched and forensically looked at. Nothing was found of any substance.
He'd said to me, if you hear from her, get in touch with me, but I didn't. But I didn't hear from him afterwards.
She was missing for a long time. I mean, she really was. I mean, it wasn't just a few days. This went on and on and on and on.
I was worried because time marched on and we didn't hear anything and didn't know anything. I don't think I wanted to ring Robert to find out if she was home, because if I had, I was going to be told that she wasn't.
Her body was found in a lay-by on the A1, just down from this bridge.
On September the 11th, 1983, 6 weeks after Diane Jones disappeared, a woman's body is discovered 50 miles from Coggeshall.
My name's Kelly Nibbs. I'm an investigator and I work on the cold case unit for Cambridgeshire Police. The body was found in a lay-by. There was a ditch just behind the lay-by which wasn't visible from the road, and that is where the body was found. In the field behind, there was the car jack which was found as well. We believe that the car jack was used as the murder weapon. Obviously, with the Diane case, when they heard that a body was found of a female around the similar age, they would have pretty quickly been on the phone to Cambridgeshire Police that they've got this missing lady. Could the body potentially belong to her?
But instead of 35-year-old Diane Jones, the body turns out to be that of 36-year-old Janice Weston.
Janice Weston was an unlikely murder victim in many ways. She was a very successful, quite glamorous professional woman. She was a lawyer. The circumstances of Diane Jones' disappearance had some similarities. Like Janice, she was a professional woman, very middle class, well-to-do, respectable. Obviously, the two police forces had a good look at, any possible links.
It is unusual to have two murders with similar circumstances. The ladies are the similar age, and the locations aren't that far apart. It's very unusual, pretty much unheard of.
Police now knew they were seeking a murderer. But had he killed one woman or two? As summer turned into autumn, Diane Jones's whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives scoured the country for clues.
The police said that anyone in Diane's phone book or whatever, please contact us for elimination purposes. I was obviously in the phone book, so I did. And that's when a detective from Coggeshall came to see me.
In Coggeshall itself, potential suspects appeared one by one. But inquiries seemed to lead nowhere.
When I was interviewed by the police and asked where I was on certain days at certain times and who I was with, I referred to this diary, which they were quite surprised I had. But as you can see, every day has an entry in it. July 23rd, okay, so that was a Saturday, yeah. And, well, I went around my mum's all afternoon, and I went out with my friends, Jeff and Andy, and my mum and dad got back off holiday. There we are, how exciting is that? All the people I was with, the police actually went and checked them out and interviewed them and said, were you with David on the night of so-and-so? So, oh, well, if he says we were, then we must have been.
This afternoon, detectives visited the farmhouse home of Dr. Jones at Coggeshall in Essex. They searched an outbuilding and took away...
They exhausted every line of inquiry as far as a missing person and more. Nothing could have been done more, I don't think, to find her at that time.
As August turned to September, then into October, every search of the area had drawn a blank. And so the focus returned once again to Lee's farm and Robert Jones.
They dug up a lot of his garden, searched the house.
They also dug up the road outside Lee's farm. There was some suggestion some work had recently been done. So there's excavations conducted there. And there was also a complete search looking for evidence of assault or anything connected with Diane.
It was on October the 22nd, 3 months after she was last seen alive, that the horrific story of Diane Jones's fate became all too clear.
To me, it was very sad that she should come to such a horrible end. To think that she'd been lying there for so long.
In 1983, in the last week of the hottest July then on record, 35-year-old doctor's wife Diane Jones had vanished without trace from her home just outside the small Essex town of Coggeshall. The search had focused around the sprawling farmhouse where she and the doctor had lived. But 3 months later, a beater with a pheasant shooting party pushed his way through a patch of woodland, a little over 30 miles away, near Ipswich.
The body of Mrs. Jones was discovered 30 miles away from her home, where she went missing in July. She was hidden in thick undergrowth in a copse near Ipswich. She died from severe head injuries. More than 100 police have been combing the area looking for a weapon.
Some shooters were going through the wood, then they found the body in a shallow grave in that wood. I was called that day, as soon as the body was found, to go up to that scene.
It was a missing person story. That changed very dramatically overnight when her body was found. Suddenly it became a murder inquiry.
I saw her in skeleton form. She still had her clothes on, but she had deteriorated quite a bit. The pathologist advised us to dig well under the body, to lift all the earth with the body. So we did that. She was dug up from that scene and taken to the mortuary at Cambridge.
Diane's gone missing at the end of July. We've gone all the way through the summer to October. We've had a very hot summer, we've had rain, we've had animals, so it wasn't possible to do a facial recognition. 2 days later, she was identified through dental records as being Diane.
The pathologist couldn't find any evidence of sexual attack. To murder somebody and leave her in a shallow grave in a wood in Suffolk, 40 miles from where she went missing, was strange without any sexual motive.
She was wearing the same dress that she was seen on the 23rd of July. That supports that whatever happened to her on that evening. Diane had 4 puncture wounds to her skull, which were quite odd, and they were sort of a square indentation.
The pathologist asked me to get a load of tools. I went to a tool merchant and bought as many tools as I could. A few days later, he called me up. He said he tested all these tools, and it was definitely a slate hammer, a slater's hammer. A hammerhead on one side, and on the other arm, a sharp point, which you can imagine if it goes into a skull, it's going to crack through the skull immediately, because that was what it was made for in the first place, to go through slates and so forth. This was exactly the wound that was caused to Diane's head, which killed her. Now, we interviewed the gardener at Lee's farm, and he said there was definitely a slate hammer in the coal bunker, which wasn't there anymore after her disappearance. Dr. Jones said that he didn't remember anything about that slater's hammer, but the gardener definitely saw it there, and it was missing on her disappearance. That weapon was never found, and we never found the murder weapon.
The final news was horrible, awful. To think that she'd been there, lying there for so long.
But I remember when they found her. Yeah. The news came through and I thought, my God. And I phoned up parents type thing. And he says, didn't you know? I says, no, I didn't.
It was a shock. When they just turn up dead, it hits you. My movements were covered, so I was kind of eliminated very, very quickly, really. And my first thought was, and it's still my thought today, my first thought went to speculating about who did it.
The inquiry seemed to be stalled, when all of a sudden, a clue emerged from the most unlikely source.
Focusing on that.
A group of men came to us who had gone past that very spot. They saw a Peugeot car parked there, and a chap in fawn clothing dragging something from the car towards where the body was eventually found. The driver said he remembered the man in fawn clothes, which Dr. Jones said he was wearing that night, and witnesses said he was wearing fawn or cream clothing.
They thought he was fly tipping, and the man was so intrigued by it, he wrote down the registration of the vehicle.
One of the passengers wrote that car number down on a magazine that he had with him. He kept it for a long while, that number, but about 2 weeks before her body was found, he unfortunately threw that number away.
The police were obviously very keen to recover the registration of the vehicle, so they employed a hypnotist to put the witness under hypnosis to try and recover that information.
A psychiatrist from the University of Surrey who'd worked with the police before on hypnosis cases. He came. I was present when he put these witnesses under hypnosis. The man who took the number said he remembered some of the number. GHK something something T. Dr. Jones's car was the same letters, and it was a Peugeot.
The driver of the vehicle could, under hypnosis, remember the number plate. But there was some concern that that detail of a vehicle had already been in the public domain in the newspapers. The danger was that that had already been revealed by the press, what his registration was. So it was unsure how valuable it was.
They decided it couldn't be relied on because the car number had been publicised in the paper. I interviewed the witness, and you have to know the people, and I really genuinely thought that chap was genuine. I thought there was a genuineness about it. We were desperate to get that car number. We even traced where the paper would have been disposed of to a tip at Cambridge, which we went to and looked at. It was enormous. So we thought, well, there's no chance of ever finding that paper. But we did have a look at that.
Detectives made a further attempt to nail this evidence. Perhaps in writing the number, an impression was left on the paper directly underneath.
The number plate was really important because it potentially put an offender at the scene. We went through all the exhibits to see if, when he'd written the registration, there was a piece of paper underneath. We used the old sort of grey pencil trick to see if anything had any registrations on that would help us. And we did recover some detail, but not of the vehicle, unfortunately.
The most precious clue detectives had seemed to have ended up on a rubbish tip. But the pressure on them to find the killer was immense. This middle-class murder had the whole country talking.
The journalists zeroed in more than they would have done had it been, let's be frank, some poor unfortunate woman living in a council estate in Liverpool who'd been, gone down the pub and been murdered by a boyfriend there. It would have been of no consequence by comparison.
The papers couldn't get enough of the story. And it seemed like everyone had a theory about who Diane's murderer could be.
Mediums were phoning up and saying they had dreams about certain things that happened. People from all over the country, giving their versions and their thoughts and their ideas, but mere speculation, really. I remember one in particular, someone from a prison near Oxford, who wanted to confess to the murder. We interviewed him in prison, but there was no connection. It was completely publicity seeking. You must follow everything, but nothing ever concrete ever came to any of those other inquiries.
The evidence police had gathered was all circumstantial, nothing which seemed to put the case beyond reasonable doubt. But 3 weeks after Diane's body was found, they decided to act.
We didn't want to arrest Dr. Jones without investigating everything else first. But we decided there was enough evidence to arrest him and question him about all these things. The morning we went there, 6 o'clock in the morning. We said, you're under arrest for, and cautioned him for the murder of your wife, Dr. Jones. He was quite cool. I've arrested murderers in my time. And he stayed very calm and collected all the way along the interview.
Police went back to their earlier line of inquiry regarding the Jones family car. The one which Diane travelled in on the night she went missing. Robert Jones had sold the vehicle just days after Diane disappeared. And it had been sold with an empty grey woman's handbag still inside. Robert Jones was asked to explain.
He said it was the one that she had in the car. Other witnesses say it wasn't the one she had when she went to the pub that night.
There was a grey handbag found in the back of the car, and Robert Jones said that's Diane's. It was believed from several sources Diane had a brown handbag in the pub that night. So the bag that was found in the car wasn't the handbag she had at the time. Where is the brown handbag she had on the evening, and why is this grey handbag in the car?
The search of Lee's farm raised other questions about items which Diane always carried with her.
Diane's lighter was recovered, and her diary was also recovered, which didn't really add up. She would have had both those items in her handbag the night she went missing.
Then new evidence emerged. Detectives learned that Dr. Jones was preparing to leave Coggeshall alone.
Dr. Jones made inquiries of working abroad just before Diane went missing.
Dr. Jones did admit this. He had made inquiries before she disappeared about going to Australia to set up a new life without Diane. They had a different passport situation then. He had both names on the passport, his and Diane's. But he went to the passport authorities and removed her name from his passport. We questioned him about that as well. And he said, well, that was because I wanted to go on my own to Australia. So he was planning to break the relationship. Whether she was aware of that, I don't know.
The doctor of this picture postcard town in the home counties was being held on suspicion that he'd beat his wife to death. Gossip on the street, gossip in the press, was rising to fever pitch. Police would soon need to charge Dr. Jones or let him walk free.
We were just looking for the truth, that was all. But unfortunately, the truth kept coming back to Dr. Jones.
In October 1983, the 3-month search for Doctor's wife, Diane Jones, came to an end. Her body was found in a wood near Ipswich, with 4 deep head wounds from a spiked hammer. But police were struggling to identify the killer. All the evidence they had was merely circumstantial. And over 3 days of interrogation, Dr. Jones continued to protest his innocence.
We investigated every other possibility before we arrested him. We chased other information, but there was never any firm line of inquiry apart from Dr. Jones.
Dr. Robert Jones has been held here at Ipswich Police Headquarters since his arrest yesterday morning. No charges have yet been brought against him, but he's still helping police with their inquiries into his wife's murder.
Dr. Jones was arrested on 13th November 1983, and he was in custody for 3 days.
Eventually, when we'd exhausted our inquiries, we released him.
Dr. Jones' 55 hours in custody at Ipswich Police Station came to an end midway through the afternoon. A blue police van with darkened windows left the station with Dr. Jones inside. At the same time, the doctor's solicitor was heading towards the village of Coggeshall to rendezvous with his client at his Essex farmhouse. He then came out into the front garden along with his solicitor to answer reporters' questions.
How have you been treated, Dr. Jones?
Very well.
Do you think that, as far as you're concerned, the inquiry's over now?
No.
Is there anything else that you can help the police with?
I wouldn't have thought so. After now, there will be no further comment to be made, and we'd be grateful if you'd disperse.
Then I wrote a report to the CPS We had to get permission on a case of this intensity and media coverage to see if they thought we had enough evidence.
It's not for the police to decide who's guilty and who isn't. They're simply an instrument for gathering all the available evidence. The file went to CPS to decide whether there was evidence to charge him for the murder of Diane. CPS will decide if there is a reasonable case to present to court. And CPS's view was there was not.
Dr. Jones had undergone 3 days of the most intense scrutiny. His story had been checked and rechecked. Nothing the police had gathered was enough even to charge him with the murder of Diane, much less convict him of the crime.
The public perception of arrest is that the person is responsible for whatever they've been arrested for. That isn't the case. An arrest doesn't mean a person is guilty of the offence.
Diane's inquest left open the question of who was responsible for her death.
Today, the coroner, Mr. Noel Watkins, recorded a verdict of unlawful killing by a person or persons unknown. The funeral for Mrs. Jones can at last take place at Tilby in Lincolnshire. Her funeral will come as a welcome relief, not only to her father, Mr. Sid Walker, but also to her husband, Dr. Robert Jones.
Diane's body was returned to the little Lincolnshire village where her life had begun. In the eyes of the law, Dr. Jones was blameless. But in many a household, tongues were wagging.
In Coggeshall, the gossip within that little town would have been, you know, and her husband's done it, you know, and he's a doctor. Of all the people to do a thing like that.
The suspicion went on and on. We can't ignore the facts, even though it could accuse us of tunnel vision, you can't ignore the facts of the case.
I'm the last person to have seen Diane Jones alive.
The man who says he saw the murderer at the scene of the crime.
I looked inside the car and there was a woman laying dead.
The other side of Diane Jones's life.
She wasn't a sex maniac. She certainly was a drink maniac. She wanted company and a good time, yeah, okay, absolutely.
Diane had a dilemma. Does she stay with her husband and lose her child, or lose her husband?
How almost 40 years later, police reinvestigate Diane's murder.
In 2021, we had some new evidence which we felt might change the opinion.
And how Dr. Jones took his secrets to the south of France.
Du tout, aucune connaissance de la vie en Angleterre. On avait l'impression, bon, la seule fois il m'a parlé de problèmes avec son ex-épouse, il m'avait dit ça me fait trop mal, je ne veux pas en parler.